Hi, everyone. My name is Svetlana Borodina. I'm a postdoctoral fellow at the Harriman Institute and the organizer of the Work of Care in Russia lecture series. I'm thrilled to welcome you all at the fourth talk of the series. We began our exploration of the various aspects of the Russian care landscape in fall 2021. And we heard fantastic talks by Maria Cristina Galmarini, Tatiana Chudakova, and Anna Klepikova. Their presentations are available on the Harriman Institute's YouTube channel. So before we begin, I just wanted to mention a few housekeeping details. So we are running this event as a webinar, and the audience can tune in on Zoom or on YouTube, where we are currently streaming live. Please don't hesitate to ask questions. If you are connecting through Zoom, you can post your questions through the Q&A feature. And if you are listening to this talk on YouTube, you can write your question into the chat. Once our speaker finishes his presentation, I will pose those questions to him during the Q&A session. Special thanks go to the Harriman Institute for supporting this series, and of course to Carly Jackson, our behind-the-scenes wizard, for helping us organize all the events of the series. And finally, of course, I am excited to introduce our speaker today, Dr. Tomas Matza. Dr. Matza is Associate Professor in the Department of Anthropology at the University of Pittsburgh. His research interests extend across the subfields of sociocultural, medical, and psychological anthropology. He studies issues of mental health, political economy, and global health, as well as the theoretical considerations of subjectivity, care, expert knowledge, and power. His work appeared in such flagship academic journals as Cultural Anthropology, American Ethnologies, Medical Anthropology Quarterly, Social Text, to name just a few. In 2018, his book, Shock Therapy, Psychology, Precarity, and Well-Being in Post-Socialist Russia, came out from Duke University Press. This book draws on fieldwork in St. Petersburg, where he explored the psychotherapy boom that followed the collapse of the Soviet Union. Today, in his presentation titled Care in the Gap, he'll explore the double bind that caregivers in Russia are often caught in, providing care and comfort on the one hand, and on the other, being dependent on institutions entangled in symbolic and material violence. Without further ado, I turn it over to Tomas.
Thank you, Svetlana. Thank you, Carly. Thank you, Harriman Institute. It's great to be here, great to be with you today. I appreciate the invitation and also the opportunity that this provided me to continue to think about these particular topics. So I think Svetlana has already indexed a little bit the particulars of my book, but let me just quickly gloss the project from which today's talk will spring. And I want to say that this work has already been published in a monograph, and so currently I'm in the sort of process of revisiting and rethinking, both in relation to this work that took place in St. Petersburg starting in 2005, and also in relation to subsequent field work that I've done in a very different context in El Salvador, also involving caregiving practices. I'll be limiting my comments today only to the work in Russia. So that particular project was contextualized within the collapse of the USSR, and I think all of you are familiar as well with the rise of consumer cultures, new democratic discourses starting in the 90s, and all of the downstream effects of rewiring everyday assumptions about what constitutes a good life. And simultaneously with these changes, which is, I think, very interesting, thing that I noticed was a new landscape of therapists, coaches, psychological trainers, and counselors, a kind of self-help industry, as well as new state institutions. And here you can see some evidence of popularization, psychology in the mass media, the rise of coaching and training as a profession, as a practice, as well as lots of different institutes for postgraduate training. Within
Tomas, I'm sorry to interrupt. You haven't shared your screen yet.
Perfect. We made the same error the first time through, and here we go. So you haven't missed much, don't worry. So let me come back here. Can everyone see now? Yes?
Yes.
Are you able to see? Okay, great. Okay, so let me back up a second. So here, so this is evidence of the sort of popular discourse of psychology, psychologists on screen. This is Dr. Kurpatov, lots of coaching and training offerings and institutes of postgraduate training. I also noticed or learned that psychology had become the most popular major at St. Petersburg State University in the time when I was doing my fieldwork. The psychology faculty had expanded considerably to 14 different subdepartments, and there were nearly 1,800 undergraduate psychology majors in the years when I did my research. Just for orientation, I think everyone knows where St. Petersburg is, but that is where I did my research. And of course, that positions what I have to say about urban Russia in a very specific locale, i.e. Russia's window to the west, very proximate to the border of the European Union with Finland, and also itself a city premised on kind of Peter the Great's westernizing vision for Russia. Okay, a quicker thing on methods and what did I do. I won't get into this too much, but I tried to go wide and also deep. I found that within psychological services, there were sort of three domains of work that were unfolding in the 2000s: commercial services, non-governmental, and state services. And the squares highlighted in black are the areas where I did most of my field work. So I focused on two key commercial services for children. And then in state services, I found one organization that was providing municipally based care for children, as well as a PND or PND, an outpatient clinic for adults. I also did some field work in the commercial context with excuse me one second, I can't see my slides. There we go. I also did some research with adults in the commercial services. So I hope this gives you a little bit of a sense of the context of my work. And what I'll be talking about today is the Psychopedagogical Medico-Social Center where I did my field work. Okay, so now I'm going to start to read, and things should go a little bit more smoothly from here on out. Okay. Care often harms. This is one of the resounding messages of many anthropologies of care, whether humanitarian, biomedical, psychiatric. Caring for someone and any potential to provide comfort often depends on institutions entangled in symbolic and material violence. And consider the many possible, often inadvertent side effects of care work that the anthropological literature documents: reproducing gendered labor formations, circulating racist ideologies through diagnosis, becoming complicit in hemispheric security schemes, promoting ableism, amplifying anti-political neoliberal empowerment regimes. But does care not also help? This is an important ethnographic question. How might those who assist be rendered in more complex terms? How might we recognize both the dangers of care, its enmeshment in relations of power, the perverse economy of charitable giving, as well as the possibilities for positive encounter, assistance, attunement? What might an anthropology of danger and possibility in the care encounter look like? This has been a central concern of my work and was something I explored in my book, which Svetlana mentioned. This study engaged the post-Soviet interest in psychotherapy and psychological training in one urban city in Russia, St. Petersburg. In that work, I traced the mixed effects of a significant growth in self-work on the politics of mental health. And I found that Russia's therapeutic turn promoted, on the one hand, a troubling instrumentalization of self, and on the other, new healing narratives, intimate association, and sociality. My concern in the book was to analyze the therapeutic turn's relationship to emerging inequality in Russia, while also grappling with the fact that therapists and their clients were caught up in a recognizably human endeavor, an effort to ease suffering, to offer and to seek out more healthful outlooks, to carve out a life that is livable, but also in some ways complicit. This tension between harm and help is one that I tried to maintain in the book. And I use the phrase "and yet" as this kind of marker for constantly preserving those aspects of social reality that are captured by and also escape our analytics. Psychologists are complicit in the reproduction of class dispositions, and yet they are also providing important aspects of support to many clients. My goal in this talk is to rehearse this tensioned analysis, one that's both critical and attuned to the ethical entailments of care provision. And I see this, as I'll mention at the end, as really important to the anthropology of care. The concept I'll offer in this talk to capture this complexity is care in the gap. And gap here draws from Anna Singh's idea that the limits of hegemony can be found in the disjuncture between what is articulated or expressed as overwhelmingly universal, emphasis on the word overwhelming or overdetermined, and on the other hand, what emerges through more ordinary social practice. Care in the gap both creates and operates in a breathing space between institutional norms and ethics of care. How did practitioners in my research create and operate within that gap? And what implications do their practices have for care's life-sustaining potentials in the face of harm? So let me begin by taking you to one of my main field sites. This is the Psychopedagogical Medico-Social Center, or PPMS, and it is located at one of St. Petersburg's less monumental and glitzy districts. It sits among large late Soviet-era apartment blocks, interspersed with green space and playgrounds. And given its relative remoteness from the city center, the PPMS caters to some of the more vulnerable in the city. Employing approximately 20 specialists in children's health, the PPMS Center seeks to address the children's therapeutic needs in a multidisciplinary way, thus the P, the M, and the S, the psychopedagogical, medical, and social. And there are, at least as of the time of the book's writing, 19 PPMS centers in St. Petersburg. This is how I came to be in that place. I had asked the director, Tatiana Fyodorovna, whether I could learn more about their work, and she had invited me to sit in on their weekly staff meetings. And on the first day, I remember winding through this sort of maze of buildings. I had to meet one of their specialists at a cell phone center in order to find it. I eventually arrived at the modest concrete structure in a quiet and brambly courtyard. And beyond the front door, I found an unlit vestibule with a trapka, or rag, partially stapled to the floor. We wiped our feet, and then Natalia handed me a pair of worn blue covers, or bahili, for my shoes. These are standard in many clinical settings, and they always marked usually who is the clinician and who is not. The staff meetings that I attended took place in a small, almost always curtained conference room, and the specialists would gather around a table, the psychologists, mostly women, mostly middle-aged, would use these meetings to discuss their difficult cases, to seek advice, and sometimes to vent. One day, as the snow covered the ground outside, Anastasia, the psychotherapist overseeing the concilium, invited someone to share. There was a long, uncomfortable silence, a fear perhaps of the heated exchanges that can take place if someone breaks protocol. And then finally, Natalia Konstantinovna, the head psychotherapist, began to talk. She offered a punctuated case history, as they often did, some drawings, something like this. This was not the actual one, but something like this, circled the room. A boy, 12 years in age, first came into the center on a crisis call from his grandmother. He is unwilling to go to school and has nightmares. His father has left the family, and God knows what the mother is doing. Binet test and hand test were administered, showing no psychiatric problems. However, on the drawing test, he shows some abnormality representing the leaves of trees with magic letters. Like many of the cases at the center, the specialist raised the question of abnormality, with drawings prompting further inquiry and analysis, and a single clinical question: should the child be forwarded on to a psychiatrist? I would hear many such cases over time, like little windows into tragedy. It was a strange, almost voyeuristic way to hear intimate things about the lives of those living on the edge of something, whether an addiction, unemployment, homelessness, a disappeared family member, all of which showed up in the center in the form of a struggling child. The demographic background of this was an unusually high mortality rate nationally, significant poverty, high suicide, and low births. And indeed, the federal wheels had already been set in motion against the so-called demographic crisis. The PPMS Center, it seemed, was one of its points of intervention. As I spent more time in PPMS, I gained a profound appreciation for the difficulty of public psychosocial assistance. But I also observed a sometimes troubling process of translation in which social suffering was turned into something therapeutically legible. This seemed to lead away from the child client's social world and into asocial domains of measurement, assessment, and referral. In the case I mentioned above, for instance, through the use of an objective test, an intelligence test, and two projective tests, hand and drawing, what sounded like a difficult family situation involving abandonment, a grandmother in desperation, was rendered in terms of possible individual pathology. The tests appeared as a last refuge for the frustrated psychologists, as well as filters through which the social environment of the child was perhaps less likely to pass. It seemed, in other words, that I was seeing an example of pathologizing and individualizing social suffering, a pattern that has been documented and critiqued in a variety of other fields beyond anthropology, including cross-cultural psychiatry, anti-psychiatry, as well as post-structural analyses of the psi professions. And as I learned more about the founding of these centers and saw the kinds of psychosocial work being done outside state services and other contexts, I began to wonder how this familiar patterning of assistance had come to be. After all, as other parts of my research had shown, the therapeutic turn that had begun in Russia 10 years prior had actually been premised on a turn towards holistic, humanistic mental health services. And indeed, in the marketplace for psychological services, this seemed to have remained in place, at least in the sense that clients were more fully elaborated as feeling subjects, even though this was happening in a rather more commodified and instrumentalized way. So how did this narrowing focus on individual cognitive function come to be in public institutions? What had shaped that process? And to what possible effect for the child client and the practitioner? So in the book, I explored this curious fact that the shift from emotions to cognition and public therapy parallels a series of ministerial reforms begun by the Putin administration in the early 2000s. Termed modernization, educational institutions had come under increased bureaucratic scrutiny at the same time that a variety of other social issues were coming to the fore. In considering what was happening in the PPMS Center alongside these broader reforms, I speculated that the shift to more narrowly cognition in the PPMS may have been a product of economic modernization, which sought to lend practical and effective techniques to the psychologists providing care in the centers. If that was so, though, what I saw in my fieldwork in the center was a series of other unintended, perhaps, effects of modernization, i.e., it also seemed to have enabled new kinds of bureaucratic performance in which municipal officials and scholars and psychologists working to maintain the PPMS system invoked languages of systematicity and accountability as a way to sustain their existence. With the material conditions of care remaining challenged, however, the imperative to push towards efficiency and order seemed to allow children and their problems to fall through the cracks. Moreover, the modernization of their work, which they termed accompaniment or сопровождение, not only severely constrained the therapeutic scope, it also by extension shaped the subject positions of care recipients, the children, as risky and functionally broken. To arrive in PPMS was to be seen in a particular way. And again, the contrast with commercial services, where I also did fieldwork, is instructive. There, in commercial context, the young client, usually from a well-to-do family, was framed by the psychological programs as potential filled and in need of a bit of emotional intelligence. Given the PPMS approach, what I found was a fairly clear instance of a differentiated management of affect. In one case, in the PPMS, affective experience was downplayed as a cognitive process in need of repair. In the other, in the commercial services where I did fieldwork, affect was rendered sensible as emotion and potential. The pattern was troubling in the sense that it reflected in particularly intimate terms, intrasubjective terms, emerging class differences in Russia. Okay, so in the pages that follow, I'm going to elaborate a bit more on this economic modernization and what it meant for educational institutions. And then I'll try to draw that back into a discussion of how I saw that reform being manifested in the practices of PPMS. And for this part of the paper, I will use care as a kind of general term to denote the mental health services and practices, a kind of ethics of concern for others, in the words of Lisa Stevenson. And what I offer you as in terms of a portrait of modernization in PPMS will appear as a predictively problematic situation in which child clients are warped in the context of an overall system that is conditioned by and reflects back into the population Russia's emerging class differences. In this sense, perhaps care harms after all. But then to complicate this picture of mental health care, I will then bring these critical observations about the PPMS's work into contact with a different sort of ethnographic account. I found that PPMS practitioners were not merely the faithful or woeful agents of a governmental strategy to reduce costs and the scope of care. Instead, they also pursued care beyond cognition, developed their own institutional networks, and provided assistance in cases where, legally speaking, they were not allowed to do so. So rather than a pure story of violence enacted between psychologist and client, I'm ultimately going to propose an account of shared and in many cases gendered precarity, in which the dangers of intervention are constantly funneled down to the therapeutic encounter. This is what I will call care in the gap, a way of conceptualizing the risks and opportunities involved in assisting others. Okay, so becoming psychological, from humanization to modernization. I may be doing some compression in this section in the interest of time, but I want to offer a little bit of historical context here and return to the question I asked earlier. How did the narrower focus onto cognition come to be in the PPMS? So the PPMS is part of a network of public institutions serving school children that was created in the mid-1990s and legally enshrined in 1998. The network had grown by 2005. When I began my research, there were already approximately 750 such centers across Russia, employing 64,000 specialists nationally. And the origin of the system can be traced to a perestroika era effort to humanize Soviet institutions, as well as a broader blossoming of interest in non-biomedical talk therapies. That is to say, talk therapies that take place outside the context of psychiatric environments, that would also eventually feed the growth of the market for services. The interest in humanizing institutions trickled into education reform as well, and reformers in the Soviet Academy of Pedagogical Sciences began agitating so-called creative potential. The PPMS center that would emerge in the 90s then was an outgrowth of those late Soviet discussions around education, subjectivity, and vitally economy. And at the heart of the idea of the PPMS network was the premise that a multidisciplinary team consisting of psychologists, pedagogues or educators, medical doctors, social workers, and speech therapists would essentially reassemble children and their needs through a holistic view of care. That really, I think, contrasts strikingly with what I found in the 2000s. The interest in holistic humanization had shifted to modernization, not only of education policy, but also technological development, housing infrastructure, and indeed subjectivity. What was modernization in the context of psychological services and education? Well, the early rhetoric I found discloses this sort of model of a self-reliant person. According to a document prepared for UNESCO in 2004, modernization in Russia ought to lead to the production of, quote, morally enterprising people who make decisions independently in a situation of choice, in a system oriented towards the development of their personalities and cognitive and creative abilities. It's a kind of neoliberal boilerplate language, which I think may not be that revealing, actually. But as I started to dig further into some of the writings around psychological services in conjunction with these reforms, what I found was a sort of deep pessimism at the base of this seemingly technical shift towards modernization. In the words of one psychologist writing in 2002, while the child's right to full-fledged and free development remains central to modernizing education, quote, unfortunately, currently more and more children are found in a position of acute social trouble, bad ecology, the growth of social aggression, economic problems, the spread of narcotics, the increase of migration, stabilities in the family, parent and teacher incompetence. These and many other factors are becoming external boundaries of the process of development of the child. In essence, The humanistic, emotion-centered approach to children, not to mention her full-fledged and free development, were rendered impractical in the face of an overwhelming bad ecology. Echoing this kind of pessimistic pragmatism, consider the following methodological document governing PPMS center work. Quote, however much psychologists talked about the importance for optimizing the education of pupils for emotional stability, positive self-value, self-confidence, the fundamental burden in the learning process falls not on the emotional communicative, but on the intellectual sphere. It would be better to emphasize not the formation of the personality of the child, the systems of his communication and emotional contexts, but in the first instance, the development of his thinking. Premised on the negation of prior forms, learning falls not on emotion, but cognition. Psychological work should target not the personality, but thinking. And so the shift here was to let go of both emotional worlds and social relations. Instead, regardless of emotional well-being, it was thinking that was of interest. And so the specialist's emphasis should be on early detection and cognitive interventions. In practice, this meant that struggling children were subjected to diagnostic testing of their attention, cognitive reasoning, spatial and mathematical logic, whose tabulated results were then later discussed with teachers. Now, it was interesting to me at the time that the modernization of psychosocial services and the translation of affect into cognition was related to broader global phenomena across many industrialized countries subject to neoliberal reforms. The appearance of a managed or administered care had placed a strong emphasis on evidence-based practices, subjecting therapeutic interventions to the audit cultures of neoliberalism and global health alike. In the Russian context, the policies governing the PPMS system's operation contained a similar urgency around measurement. Issued by the Committee for Education of St. Petersburg, one study noted that in the absence of practical standards, it had become, quote, necessary to evaluate the results of the activities of these centers from the point of view of their social effectiveness. Such systematicity, the author continued, would be crucial to the legitimacy of mental health services and could be achieved through an audit process or attestatia, in which, quote, the problems, goals, and tasks of services have to be recounted, end quote. In 2005, I saw how all of this policy discourse took shape in the daily practices of the PPMS Center. Squeezed by high-flying policy rhetoric and a call for audit on the one side and difficult conditions of care on the other, modernization and its affiliated policies placed the work of the PPMS Center into a precarious situation, a kind of vice grip, as this image illustrates. The story began with attestatia, the aforementioned audit. Undertaken once every 5 years, attestatia involved a lengthy inspection lasting anywhere between several weeks to months. And when I began my fieldwork, the center was just gearing up for it. And it was apparent that attestatia was a source of great fear and anxiety. Tatiana Fyodorovna, the director, showed me the thick binders they had to put together in preparation. And these were filled with reams and reams of paper reports on caseloads, documentations of programs broken into component units of time, staffing salaries and allocations, and other such details. Meanwhile, the case documentation method alone was cause for alarm. Lacking computers, the histories were recorded in blue exam booklets or titradki, which were stored in piles in the staff break room. As the months wore on, the Wednesday morning staff meetings became increasingly charged with concern about administrative legibility. One day, for example, I observed a heated discussion about a case involving a 7-year-old boy of Iranian heritage. And based on the casebook, the boy had been in the center before. He was struggling with feeling like an outcast. He wanted to dye his hair blonde, make his name more Russian sounding, convert to Orthodox Christianity, and to his parents' dismay, had already started crossing himself. At this point, Evgenia Anatolievna, an outside specialist who often oversaw the meetings, interrupted. How does this have anything to do with the child's memory and logic problems? She asserted that what was emerging from the case file was that the child had been transferred internally, with everyone disagreeing about the problem and nobody feeling any guilt about it. In the midst of all this back and forth, it was striking that nobody had even discussed the concerning desire to efface his Iranian identity. Instead, I noticed the problem was defined in cognitive terms, and then even this issue had been eclipsed by accusations of bureaucratic buck passing. Such tensions between procedure and therapy were common at the center and in these meetings I attended. And they also highlighted how the push to audit, or attestatia, reached into the therapeutic practices by shaping the appropriate ways to discuss cases in the staff meetings. Another way the audit shaped the center's practices was through the policy emphasis on systematicity and legal norming. What was legal, what was within the mandate. Practitioners often found it necessary to offer holistic care, perhaps in the spirit of the founding of these centers, but they risked running afoul of the more narrowly defined mandate of the center to work on issues of cognitive function and remain focused exclusively on the child. In fact, many of the so-called problem children who crossed the center threshold were entangled in issues far more complicated than thinking problems. In one case involving a mother-son relationship, the son was skipping school, had developed a computer addiction, and had been going to gaming halls all day long. And when the school called and someone was sent to the boy's house to find out what was going on, he was found living in poor housing conditions and was sleeping on the floor. His mother had also locked him in his room. The specialist in the staff meeting commented, "This is concerning. What if there's a fire? I mean, is he able to go to the bathroom when he needs it?" The recommendation from the sitting specialist was to get to work on the question of computer addiction. After the case was reviewed, Anna Andreevna brought the conversation back from the narrow question of computer addiction to the issue of the safety of the child. Some of the details of this case, she said, remind me of one of my own cases. Noting her deep concern, she added with exasperation, "It's just so difficult to know what to do and where to turn for help." Anna, I would later learn, had been trying to offer her clients legal advice while also delivering therapeutic services outside the strict constraints of the center. But at this point in the meeting, the director, Tatiana Fyodorovna, became very upset. She said, "Too much time has been wasted on this. The work that Anna Andreevna is doing is not our responsibility. We should have written a letter to the local inspector long ago to absolve us of further responsibility." She then turned the discussion to results, pressing Anna Andreevna to describe what had actually come from all of her extra efforts. Anna Andreevna sank into her chair in silence. So what were the effects of modernization on the work at the center? What I observed in the staff meetings and the life of the center was that modernization in general and attestatia in particular, in combination with under-resourcing, extreme social need, and constrained legal mandates, seem to have come together, again, this image of a vice, to make the practitioner's work extraordinarily difficult. Further, modernization structured the translation of affect in particular ways, figuring care as measurable, and the child as a brain with thinking and or memory problems whose challenges could be individuated and then captured through the deployment of cognitive diagnostics. The narrowing nature of this work, effectively, subjectively, and socially, again, is made particularly clear when contrasted with the work that I found for middle-class children. And as I describe in my book, which was based on fieldwork I conducted in a psychological education camp in which Russian kids were taken over the border to Finland. There, the young clients were often invited to encounter their own internal emotional worlds. In a way, much the way that children in PPMS were, through drawing. Yet the locus of interpretation in those other contexts remained at the site of production, if you will. The child, the drawer of the picture, rather than a group of gathered specialists. And the aim of the work in commercial context was cultivation of emotional intelligence rather than diagnosis and correction. As Regeneration, which I call it, mentions in its advertising, knowledge is power. In order to be successful in life, a person has to understand himself, to know his pluses and minuses. So in the face of the various structural constraints in the PPMS, poverty, social precarity, under-resourcing, and audit, did state psychologists simply enact the modernization of care? In fact, the longer I looked, the more I found that practitioners took a variety of forms of initiative beyond the view of the state inspectors, and apparently also in some cases the center director. For example, it was possible for practitioners to contract with other centers, establishing, apart from city municipal governmental structures, a kind of improvised system to coordinate work on shared cases. Thus, in a sense, effectively in a grassroots kind of way, supplementing a lacking administrative structure. And as Anna Andreevna's frustrated and concerned response to the case of the boy sleeping on the floor shows, the legal mandate to protect the rights of the child could be creatively, if surreptitiously, reinterpreted, leaving room around how a practitioner should intervene. Such instances of legal indeterminacies, how I refer to it in the book, made it possible to pursue more diverse forms of care. Especially interesting were the stories of another kind of indeterminacy, therapeutic indeterminacy. And as I got to know the psychologists better, they began telling me more about the improvised techniques that they used in care that were so-called off the books. These stories could be moving instances of interpersonal connection in which clients also re-scripted the encounter. Considering the following example, in 2013, as my fieldwork for this project was coming to an end, I met up with Zoya, a young psychologist who had only been training when I started my fieldwork in 2005, and had gone on to become a staff psychologist at the center. When we spoke, she shared with me her therapeutic experience with a young girl who I call here Alessia. Alessia had become one of the oldest clients at the center, having spent the last 10 years in therapy. She had first come to the center as an unruly, misbehaving child and was assessed at having language deficiencies and developmental delays. Her performance was so poor in school that she was put into special education. And Zoya found this peculiar. As she got to know Alessia, she found her to be extremely intelligent, and only struggling with some attention deficit, poor eyesight, and hearing. Her cognitive function, in other words, was only part of the story. To meet this child where she was, Zoya and her mentor developed certain tricks departing from standard protocols and exercises aimed at bolstering memory and numerical skills. They taught her to play cards, chess, and checkers, taught her English, and engaged with her as a person, as Zoya said. Over time, Olesya became very capable. She often defeated the staff at the games, and her confidence grew. She also refused the category of therapy, redefining the terms of their encounters as a kind of friendly relationship, for example, referring to Zoya somewhat stubbornly, using the diminutive form of address. And then for her part, Zoya also overruled certain legal norms governing her work by accompanying Olesya to apply for professional school. So Zoya's story for me was a kind of a revelation, something of a revelation. And the creative techniques implied, the refusal of the category of the cognitive, the hierarchies therein, the committed care that Zoya demonstrated, these were moments in which the center's work became visible in ways, visible to me anyway, and to them in ways that would not necessarily be legible administratively. Indeed, they could even be problematic under attestatia. There was a kind of dimension or degree of excess at work here, where human interactions and negotiations, in a word, sociality resulted. Conclusions. Okay, so I think I'm doing all right on time, which is good news for all of us. In this talk, I've tried to draw out the tensions in mental health care work in the center. On the one hand, I described how structural forms and administrative process sort of came together to narrow the subject position of the care recipient in municipal services. And I tried to describe how, from the point of view of policy, the child was not so much a social being as the seat of an underperforming brain in need of assessment and correction. And also that this really contrasted with the figuring of the child in the commercial contexts as a sort of more fully fledged being. And if you want to sort of dive more into that contrast, I don't have time here, but it's documented at length in the book. So that was the sort of narrowing of the child. On the other hand, I also discussed, through reference to Zoya's narrative, how springing up here and there around the staff meetings and also in Anna's case and through the therapeutic encounter itself, specialists were engaged in what I'm going to call today care in the gap. So in conclusion, on the basis of the work of Russian state psychologists, what broader conclusions can be drawn about this way of conceptualizing care as care in the gap? I'll spend the last few minutes talking about that. So care involves, and I think this is clearly known by anyone who considers care, it involves a double bind between diverging and difficult courses of action. On the one hand, enacting policy and possibly neglecting the client. On the other hand, improvising to help and possibly neglecting policy. What I've tried to show in this talk is that there is at least always a possibility to care otherwise, and that possibility exists in the gap, in this case, between modernization and an improvised ethics of care. Or, to put it in the terms of the political theorist Jacques Rancière, it is a possible politics juxtaposed with police. For Rancière, politics involves practices of emancipation that seek to transform the distribution of the sensible, and which are premised on what he calls heterology, a kind of connection or association or solidarity across difference. I want to suggest that we might conceive of care in the gap in similar terms, as a form of healing posed in some relationship with the harms of institutional violence. And in our analyses of care, we have to walk and chew gum at the same time. I want to suggest that thinking about care in the gap may be one way to do that. Not too long ago, I read, along with probably many others in Medical Anthropology Quarterly, a great piece by Duclos and Criado. And I read it with both interest and also a sense of kind of being caught. They argue that the scholarly politics of care may be in trouble, at risk, these are their words, at risk of calcification, of becoming a placeholder for a shared desire for comfort and protection. This scholarly deployment of care, they argue, is merely palliative, and thus anthropologists' attachment to the analytics of care may well benefit from being troubled. I think this is a really serious and important intervention, and in other writings, I've been starting to make some trouble for myself by exploring my own attachments to the palliative politics of care. I'm going to leave that self-reflection to the side mostly for the moment now. I don't have time to develop it. But what I want to say here, following Duclos and Criado's point, is that as an analytic, care in the gap is, I have to admit, a form of scholarly politics. Like the politics of my interlocutors, analysis entails particular assumptions about what practices count as politics, who the relevant actors are, and what are the horizons of possibility. What are the scholarly politics here? Well, beyond my somewhat ambivalent liberal progressivism, as well as the difference that studying these questions in the context of Russian neo-authoritarianism makes, as an anthropologist, I think it's very important to attend to care in complex and human terms. Doing so avoids the kind of analytic violence that comes from turning individuals into identity-less representatives of a state apparatus. But also as an ethical practice, thinking about care in these ways, we attune to possibility, even in the face of foreclosure. And I would say that also attending to these complexities of care is also ethnographically substantiated. To those ends, I move to my final points here. Indeed, many of the staff conflicts I observed arose precisely in the contexts of those moments or instances of indeterminacy and initiative. Indeterminacy, often a kind of gappy resource for practitioners, always carried a certain risk. At least in my field sites, any inventive response to legal or therapeutic indeterminacy also placed those that worked with it at risk. And given their positionality as underpaid women, the risks were also gendered in particular ways. We might also wonder whether indeterminacy is a productive mode of government, which may discipline by shifting the responsibility for any care practice, improvised, taken to the gendered individual. The hazards that stem from this situation can range from internal reprimands and the creation of an unpleasant work environment to failing subsequent state inspections, because improvisation is itself illegible and thus potentially illegal. As a result, when placed within the framework of illegality, care in the gap also poses some problems for those who exercise agency in its productive spaces. And yet, Borenstein and Redfield, in their deconstruction of the forces of compassion, suggest that on the ground, neither the politics nor the ethics of common human feeling remain simple. At the PPMS, where women psychologists labor for low pay and are driven by a desire to care, that much appears to be true. In response to the complex ethics of common human feeling, these materials prompt a bifocal attention to harm and help. If modernization signifies a political domain of intervention, the ethics of care that take shape within PPMS cannot be neatly subsumed by the politics of modernization. And if care in the gap is a possible practice of emancipation, it also cannot be romantically divorced from considerations of power. Care in the gap may help us to approach caregivers as we all are, situated subjects who share some of the precariousness of those met in the encounter, noting that virtue cannot be totally prescribed or predetermined, Michael Jackson suggests that much ethical activity is best understood as a function of the relationship between unpredictable situations and extant moral norms. The moral worth of any action, he adds, lies in what we achieve within the limits of what is possible. Analyses of care must be as attuned to political constraints as to ethical possibilities. In our ethnographic engagements with the globally expanding desire to help in precarious times, we and our interlocutors will benefit from more carefully tracing the consequences of constrained action so that one is neither taken in by the soft voice of the humanitarian nor sent in reactionary fashion running the other way. Thank you very much for your attention. And I'm going to stop sharing and we'll look forward to questions and comments.
Sorry, I was muted. Thank you so much, Tomas. This was fantastic. I wanted to remind our audience that you could ask questions and you can do so both on Zoom and YouTube. So on Zoom, please use the Q&A feature to type your questions. And on YouTube, you can just type your question into the chat box and I'll ask the question now. So I'll take the privilege of asking the first question, and I'm not really sure if it's really well formulated yet, but because I'm going to try to package kind of different thoughts that emerge here and there throughout the talk into one question. So I was interested, broadly speaking, of the kind of the ecology and other bordering systems within kind of in the gap between which this care is located, kind of. And what made me think about what I've been thinking in particular, so the kind of the low income background, as well as kind of social kind of inequality and kind of occupying the lower ranks of social hierarchies, prompts me to think about the punitive system too, as one of the kind of the mechanisms of social control that definitely acts on the groups and populations that occupy that position. So I was curious about how the kind of the psychological system interacts and kind of what does that border look like? Mm-hmm. And then on the other hand, and this is where maybe it's going kind of in a different direction, but kind of I think stays within the same question, is the family, as well as kind of and approached from various angles, one of which is the kind of the official discourse that is predicated on this, on the conservative discourse of the traditional family values and the kind of this pronatalist policy that is comes from, so what happens in the family there and the moralization of child rearing and how, and what does that kind of border look like too? And so, yeah, so that would be my very big question.
Great. Thank you, Svetlana. I love it. Great. Really generative questions. And I'm glad the talk came through sort of intact. It was communicated. So about this, yeah, so thank you for this question, because I think what you're getting at is something that maybe was more implicit than explicit in the talk, or should have been more explicit, which is that by thinking about a gap, I'm also bringing into the picture or focus the notion that there are surrounding structures, if you will, or contexts, or norms also. I use the term in the book biopolitical norms, and so I think that's also a piece of that which is around or surrounds the gap. So it's a really important piece here. So about the punitive system piece. Here, what I saw in the fieldwork was a pretty good example of of creating a gap in which to operate. The PPMS specialists, as part of their effort to constitute a system of intramural institutional connections, didn't look to the municipal or federal government for guidance. Rather, they made direct person-to-person contact with the police, actually, in their municipality, in an effort to sort of funnel children who might have appeared in the punitive system into their sort of purview of PPMS assistance and accompaniment rather than punitive response. So it was interesting in the sense that it was an interinstitutional connection premised on working together that also moved children from one, let's just say, politico-juridical domain into another, into one that was at least not explicitly punitive. I mean, there were other punitive sequelae that you could see happening in PPMS, but it was not connected to the police authorities necessarily. So I think that's grassroots kind of system building would be one gappy practice there in relation to the punitive system. They also were just a site for referrals from the the schools for special education where Alessia had spent time, and so I think that the longer they were able to keep kids within their environments, the longer they were able to control the therapeutic outcomes. So one other piece I think is really important, and I'll try to keep this a little bit more brief in the interest of time, but is this the psychiatric institutional interface was another one. They were, as an institution, themselves a kind of intervention into a more punitive form of psychiatric care where, a lot of heavy stigma was associated with psychiatric care, and it could affect your ability to work, being placed na uchot or kind of on this sort of registry. And so there, the gappiness consisted in a lot of anxiety around referrals. And I heard a lot of consideration and discussion about the hesitancy to refer because of the implications that would have for the potential implications for their clients. And finally, about pronatalism, I mean, maybe here is where the practices of emancipation fall a bit short. I did find if your political perspective as an observer is one premised on sort of non-binary, less traditionally loaded, moralizing ideas about gender relations and about the patriarchal family and the heteronormative family, the PPMS was not a place where resistance to those forms was happening. And in fact, those discourses circulated quite abundantly in my observation of the staff meetings. So it's a mixed bag, right? I mean, and I think what I'm trying to show is that these are complexly situated caregivers rather than they can't be rendered in singular terms. So, thank you very much.
I really love I love this how you hold this entire complexity together. I love this about your work. We have a question from the audience, Liliana Pantovic, and so
hi Liliana.
She asks, could you elaborate the concept of the gap, how it relates to Anna Singh's work, and can it be extrapolated to other contexts of care?
Yeah. Okay. Well, nice to hear your voice, Liliana. I hope you're doing well. Liliana was a fabulous grad student at University of Pittsburgh and does great work on reproductive health in Serbia, and I'll check her out. I'll check her work out. So gap, yeah. So I love, in general, I love Anna Singh's take on the analysis of global capitalism, and one of the things that I appreciate most about it is the way that I think she too has a sort of unflinchingly critical view of processes of resource extraction. If we're thinking about the book Friction, But also, and also in some ways, the extractive practice is not only of logging, but also of environmentalists, particularly Western conservation, in the way that it creates particular ideas about human and non-human relationships. But always in Singh's work is an effort also to find the sort of weediness or gappiness that is constantly emerging at the intersection of structures which I think we may see as overdetermining: global capitalism, Western conservationism, extraction, colonialism. But at the interface, I think, of different institutional structures and human practices, social practices, there's always this kind of disjuncture or gap that exists. I find it in my personal life. I mean, as a political being, as a political subject, and so in that sense, I do think that Singh's ideas about gappiness can be applied to a variety of analyses of political subjectivity as a way to complexify it. Thinking last thing, mushroom at the end of the world, which is another great example of this. I mean, we see on the one hand a portrayal of a world in the context of the Anthropocene, which is in decline, a state of ruination brought about by human activities on the landscape, in the air, in the oceans, and so forth. But on the other hand, Singh is always looking for and finding possibilities in the context of ruin. I think that's a pretty interesting way for us all to think about at least politically situated actors. It may not be a revolutionary program, however.
Thank you, Thomas. I have another question. I wanted to ask you to give a little bit more texture to the professionals that you observed. I'm sure there was not enough time for the talks, but I really would be curious to kind of to humanize them a little bit and situate them a little bit more within their professional domain, as well as kind of in Russia too.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Thanks. Thank you for that. One of the things that was really important, or an important trend, or quality or aspect of the mostly women. I think there were 2 male practitioners, and then the remaining 17 or so were women. And a really important feature was that they were all in their second careers. And I think this is a feature of the therapeutic turn and what it enabled for people who had a variety of other professional lives in engineering, sometimes also in teaching, who then turned to different kinds of credentialing to get new training in these spheres. So that, I think that would be a really important professional dimension. At a personal level, I met so many people, both in commercial and also state sectors, who themselves, and I think this is really common in the mental health fields, who themselves had some form of mental health crisis, who found psychology as a personal resource, as an individual resource, and then became really, I think, compelled by what it did for them. I'm thinking of a woman I start my book with, who had been, I mean, it's kind of a shock, one of the more shocking stories, but had been in several lost relationships, and including one involving a car crash of a partner who became suicidal, and found therapy as a kind of life-saving tool. And that's what drove her to become a therapist herself and enter into training. A man who created one of the first psychotherapy institutions in Russia in the commercial sector, had been a late Soviet psychologist, and was motivated to begin to introduce new therapeutic practices, including Freudian psychoanalysis, but also human potential psychology and the existential psychology of Irvin Yalom into late Soviet groups for alcoholics. And then the last one I'll give you is an example of, well, actually two more examples. And a woman I call Ira found psychotherapeutic trainings to be the most exciting social settings she had ever encountered in her life, enabling forms of stranger relationality that she had found completely lacking in her life as a student in the late Soviet period. So for her, it was about sociality. And then the last thing, there are some people who were in it who saw it as a career, right, as a way to become middle class themselves, and certainly in the commercial sector, it enabled some forms of travel, leisure travel, and upward social mobility. So yeah, all of the, I hope that gives a little more texture, but you're right. In this talk, I didn't have much chance to do that.
And I thank you. And I really appreciated also how you write about the difference between the socioeconomic standing of the professionals who work in the commercials in the commercial sector versus those who work in the state-run institutions. And so kind of connected to this, but have you noticed how kind of other markers of difference played into kind of situating these people in the occupations that they ended up having during your research? I'm just curious, not necessarily, but
yeah. So interesting. I would say that public services were more feminized than commercial services, and that would be consistent with, I think a lot of writing on the gendering of care, and particularly care as unremunerated or under-remunerated. I mean, they were not making great salaries there, and were constantly taking side work to either continue to work there or move out of it. They were also middle-aged in PPMS, whereas the practitioners who were working in regeneration, the commercial sector, were younger. I would say they were actually in their first careers, or rather than second careers, and there tended to be more of a balance between male and female psychologists, male identifying and female identifying psychologists. So, in that sense, it was a domain of money-making opportunity that I think has important gendered and also generational, if we're thinking about the last Soviet generation that Alexei Yurchak writes about. What were the avenues available to differently situated people vis-a-vis political history? I think that the younger folks had the flash, and perhaps they were a bit more in tune with the kinds of concerns that well-to-do parents had for what they thought their children needed to sort of adapt to this new, market society. Yeah. So age, gender mixture, and class, I think, would be one of the really important axes, I guess.
It also makes me think of our previous talk that Anna Klepikova gave. And so her work is in psychoneurological internet. Oh, God.
Okay.
I don't know.
I'm sorry, I missed it. Yeah. I'll look for it.
So she studies also state-run institutions that are significantly underfunded. And it was an interesting discovery. I guess I don't remember actually if she mentioned it in her talk or it's in her book, that the relationship between really severely underpaid employees there, so-called, I don't remember if they're called nanny or anyway, so caregivers basically, is that they somehow sometimes develop these quasi-familial relationships with the people, mostly with the children, because I think that case comes from the penny for children, for the children. And I was and she describes how partially because of the underfunded and kind of quite precarious conditions in which they live. And so the emergent kind of alternative dependencies that they cultivate at the workplace, how the familial and the work and the care kind of all merge together in this very interesting way, and how it does truly also coexist with the sometimes utilitarian kind of or more instrumental attitudes at the workplace that target kind of other people. So I just found that there is very interesting resonances kind of with your work too, although they target very different populations.
Yeah, that's really interesting. I didn't, the way that my, how could I say that? I was not able to observe spaces in which those quasi-familial relations would have been observable in the PPMS. And I think that was really structured by the kinds of, access I had. And it is important to mention that what I write about here is mediated by a staff, it was a discourse of the psychologists about the children, right? So, so I wasn't able to, Jesus, sorry, that's my doorbell. It's so freaking loud. So I wasn't able to observe that, but in the commercial context, certainly, and this is different from what you were saying. The psychologists did frame the camps, the psychological education camps, as kinds of quasi-familiar environments, but not as a way of supplementing or personalizing professional relationships, maybe the way that Michelle Rifkin-Fish writes about, but more as almost like an attractant for the kids, so that they would begin to see these commercial psychological education camps as places where they could be almost as part of an alternative family where they're being taught alternative norms. This might also be interesting to our colleague, that these personalized relationships, or from the fusion of familial care work and together in under-resourced settings, is something I did observe in El Salvador, actually, which was the subsequent project that I did, and those were child welfare centers where caregivers used all kinds of languages of kinship, including diminutive and familial nicknames to refer to the children there. Interestingly, the intervening NGO sought to change this, because they saw it as a form of problematic closeness, which was interfering with children's ability to build more suitable relations of attachment. So that could be another interesting contrast that maybe I could talk about with her at some point.
I know we're over time, but your last comment just sparked my last question that I really wanted to ask. And this would be, so now, especially given that you have worked in such different contexts,
right?
What is this is a very kind of frequent question, and what is Russian about that situation? What is maybe post-socialist about the Russian situation? What is kind of unique, right, about the kind of the kind of ecology of caregiving that you got to observe? Yeah,
I mean, the culture question, right? I have been getting this question for a long time, and at first I was like, oh my God, what am I doing wrong? Why don't I have a better answer to this? So I would say, first of all, I've tended to avoid that framework because it always seems to lead into a kind of reification, right, of what is Russia actually, or what is post-socialism? But I also realize that that's really a lame answer. So so I think my way to think about that has been to think about the way that psychological or mental health services, as I observed them in St. Petersburg, had been constituted in particular ways by the social and political history that came before. So what is Russian about it? What is Russian about it is the fact that psychiatry and psychological services had been constituted in particularly close relationship to Marxist-Leninism, starting with the Stalinist period, but then had also oscillated between more sort of liberalizing and more materialist conceptions of the psyche. So I think that's a very distinctive foundation on which the therapeutic turn builds, and it's based, and of course then also channels what is sayable and practicable in particular directions. That, in a sense, makes it post-socialist, right? So thinking about the institutional discourses, forms of knowledge and practice would be, I think, one way to come at that question. I think that then the second thing for me, what's unique and important, and this connects back to the analysis of care, which is what we're here to do today, is to, I think that doing work on care in the context of Russia, which has a very different political genealogy from the liberal West, means that we have to think in different ways about what care means, how it works, and what its political implications are. So for instance, I would say that Lisa Stevenson, who I was mentioning to you earlier, Stevenson's analysis of anonymous care in settler colonial Canada could lead us to a very sort of severe critique of care practices in Russia. But I don't think that that kind of transmutation of that case or any other cases that are particularly critical of care really works in a context which has a very different political genealogy. So, and that I think has really undergirds my scholarly politics as well, which I was alluding to at the end of the talk. So thank you. These were great. I loved chatting with you and Liliana, and I hope it was comprehensible to others who were here.
Thank you so much. I really love your scholarship, and it is so thought-provoking. And yeah, thanks for finding time to present your work to us today.
My pleasure.
Just my last comment would be that I thank everyone for joining us too. I hope you enjoyed the talk. And I wanted to let you know that our next and concluding talk of the series will take place on February the 23rd, as usual at noon Eastern Time. And we'll hear a presentation by Dr. Eugene Reiko, who is Associate Professor of Anthropology at the Department of Comparative Human Development at the University of Chicago. And he's the author of the book Governing Habits, Treating Alcoholism in the Post-Soviet Clinic. Tune in if you have time, and have a happy beginning of the semester, everyone, and take care.